Throw her out of my boardroom. Daniel Mercer didn't raise his voice, but it landed heavier than a shout, sharp enough to slice through the polished silence of the 42nd floor, where floor-to-ceiling windows framed the Manhattan skyline in cold morning light, and a dozen executives sat frozen around a glass table worth more than most people's annual salary. The faint hum of the HVAC system, the only sound left breathing as every eye turned, not to him, but to the woman standing near the edge of the room with a gray cleaning cloth in her hand, her name badge slightly tilted, Ava Brooks, Facilities, her uniform simple, her presence small by design, the kind that learned to exist without being seen, except now she was seen, and not in the way that gave power. Daniel adjusted his cufflinks without looking at her again, already moving on in his mind, already calculating margins, acquisitions, outcomes, because people like Ava were variables he never needed to account for, not in rooms like this, not in deals measured in 8 and 9 figures. And yet she didn't move, not right away, her fingers tightening just slightly around the cloth as her eyes drifted, not to him, but to the open laptop at the far end of the table, a financial model still glowing on the screen, rows of projections stacked in neat precision, except they weren't precise, not to her, not after what she'd just seen in a passing glance, something subtle, something buried, something wrong. Sir. Her voice was quiet, almost swallowed by the room itself, but it carried just enough to make one junior analyst blink. Daniel paused, just barely, like a man deciding whether a sound was worth acknowledging, then exhaled through his nose. You're still here, he said flatly, not a question, just a statement of inconvenience. A few soft chuckles followed, restrained, careful, nobody wanting to be the loudest in the room. Ava stepped forward half an inch, not enough to challenge, just enough to be heard. I think there's an error in your projections, she said, and this time the silence changed. It tightened, shifted, like air before a storm. Daniel finally looked at her, really looked, for the first time, his gaze cool, measured, dismissive. You think, he repeated, slow, almost amused, that you understand a financial model my team spent 3 weeks building. Another ripple of laughter, sharper now, more confident. But Ava didn't smile, didn't shrink. Her eyes flicked once more to the screen, to a column that didn't reconcile, to a risk factor disguised as stability. It's not balancing correctly, she said, softer now, but steadier. The growth curve. It doesn't match the liabilities. A senior associate shifted in his seat, frowning, almost involuntarily, his fingers tapping his tablet as if to check. Daniel noticed that, just for a second, and something in his jaw tightened, barely visible. That's enough, he said, the room snapping back to his authority. You're not paid to think about this. His tone colder now. Final. The kind that ended conversations, ended careers, ended moments before they could grow. Ava held his gaze for 1 second longer than expected, not defiant, not submissive, just present. Then she nodded once, small, controlled, and turned toward the door, her shoes making almost no sound against the polished floor, and behind her, the screen still glowed. The numbers still sat there, quiet, waiting, unnoticed by the man who had just dismissed the only person in the room who had seen what they really meant. The door clicked shut behind Ava with a soft, final sound that barely reached the boardroom. But something about it lingered, like a loose thread no one had noticed yet. And for a moment Daniel Mercer stood still, eyes on the glass table, fingers resting near the edge as if the meeting had not just been interrupted, as if nothing had shifted. Let us continue, he said, voice smooth again, controlled, the kind that rebuilt order in seconds. A few executives nodded quickly, eager to return to familiar ground. The lead analyst cleared his throat and turned the laptop slightly. As we were saying, the projected revenue curve for Q4 shows a 12% increase driven by. He paused, just briefly, his eyes narrowing at the screen, his finger hovering over a row of numbers. Hold on, he muttered under his breath, almost too quiet to matter, but it did, because the room caught it. Daniel's gaze lifted, sharp now. What is it? He asked, not impatient. Not yet, just alert. The analyst swallowed, scrolling, tapping, recalculating something quickly. It is probably nothing, he said, but his voice did not match his words. The confidence had thinned. Another associate leaned in, looking over his shoulder. No, Wait, she said, pointing. That liability adjustment, it does not align with the growth curve. A subtle shift moved through the room. Not panic, not even concern yet, just a ripple of discomfort, like a perfectly balanced structure tilting by a fraction of an inch. Daniel straightened, his posture tightening. Explain, he said again, but this time there was weight behind it. The analyst hesitated, then expanded the model. Columns widening across the screen, projections unfolding in layers of detail. If these assumptions are off by even 2%, he said slowly, the entire forecast collapses by the second quarter. Silence followed. Not the earlier kind. Not controlled. This one was heavier, uncertain. Daniel stepped closer to the table, his reflection faintly visible in the glass beneath the numbers. That is not possible, he said, more to himself than anyone else, his voice quieter now. The associate shook her head, eyes still locked on the screen. It is, unless the baseline inputs were miscalculated. Daniel's jaw tightened, his mind moving faster now, retracing decisions, approvals, the weeks of preparation that had led to this moment. Check it again, he said, sharper. The analyst nodded quickly, fingers moving faster across the keyboard, recalculating, verifying, double-checking every line. Seconds stretched longer than they should have, each one pulling tension tighter. Then he stopped, completely still. It is not a calculation error, he said, barely above a whisper. The model was built on incorrect assumptions. The words landed hard, heavier than any raised voice could have. And suddenly the room did not feel as large, the glass walls no longer distant, the skyline outside irrelevant, because everything inside that table had just shifted. Daniel exhaled slowly, controlled, but something in his expression had changed, something less certain, less absolute. His eyes flicked once, almost involuntarily, toward the door Ava had walked through, the faintest crease forming between his brows. Find her, he said quietly, not looking at anyone in particular, but the command carried, immediate, unmistakable. A junior assistant stood up too fast, chair scraping lightly against the floor. Yes, sir, she said, already moving. And as the door opened again, letting in the distant hum of the hallway, Daniel remained where he was, staring at the numbers that no longer obeyed him. The same numbers she had seen in a single glance, the same mistake he had dismissed in a single moment. And for the first time that morning, the room did not feel like his anymore. The hallway outside the boardroom felt warmer, softer, like a different world entirely. But Ava Brooks did not slow down as she walked, her steps steady, controlled, the faint squeak of her rubber soles barely audible against the polished floor, her grip tightening slightly around the cleaning cloth as if it anchored her to something real, something predictable. Behind her the door had already closed, sealing away the tension, the voices, the sharp edges of a room that had never been meant for her. And yet her mind was still there, replaying the numbers, the imbalance, the quiet misalignment that had pulsed beneath the surface of that model like a hidden fault line. She reached the service corridor, the light shifting from cool white to a softer yellow, the air carrying a faint scent of detergent and metal carts. Familiar, safe. She exhaled slowly, her shoulders lowering just a fraction. You should not have said anything. A voice muttered inside her, not loud, just present, the voice of experience, of years spent learning when to speak and when to disappear. But another part of her did not agree, the part that had recognized the pattern instantly, the part that had once spent long nights reviewing similar projections, searching for risks others missed. She stopped beside a supply cart, placing the cloth down carefully, her fingers brushing against the edge of a folded checklist, her name printed neatly at the top, Ava Brooks. She stared at it for a second, as if reminding herself where she stood now, what her role was supposed to be. Then footsteps approached quickly from behind, sharper, less measured. Hey, wait. The voice came slightly breathless. Ava turned slowly, her expression calm but guarded. A young assistant stood there, tablet clutched tightly against her chest, eyes wide with urgency. Mr. Mercer wants you back, she said, the words tumbling out too fast. Ava blinked once, processing. Not surprised, not exactly, but not moved either. He already made it clear I am not needed, she replied quietly, her tone even. The assistant shook her head, stepping closer. No, it is not like that, she said, lowering her voice. Something is wrong with the model. They cannot figure it out, and he thinks you saw something. The hallway seemed to hold its breath. For a second, Ava's gaze dropped briefly to the tablet in the assistant's hands, the edge of the screen still glowing with the same spreadsheet she had glimpsed moments ago. The same columns, the same silent error. She could feel it again, that pull, that instinct to step back in, to fix what was broken, but her posture remained still, grounded. I am not part of that team, she said, her voice softer now, but firm. The assistant hesitated, uncertainty flickering across her face. Maybe you should be, she said without thinking, then immediately looked down, as if the words had crossed a line. Ava did not respond right away, her eyes lifting slightly, not toward the assistant, but toward the distant glass walls at the end of the corridor, where the skyline stretched beyond, bright and indifferent. For a brief moment, something passed through her expression, not anger, not pride, something quieter, deeper. The memory of a different life, a different room, a different seat at a table like that. Then it was gone, replaced by the same calm presence she carried everywhere. If I come back, she said slowly, meeting the assistant's eyes again. It is not because he asked. The assistant nodded quickly, not fully understanding, just relieved. Of course, she said, stepping aside slightly, giving space. Ava picked up the cloth again, folding it once, precise, deliberate, then set it back on the cart, as if closing one chapter before stepping into another, her steps turning back toward the boardroom, measured, quiet. But this time, the hallway felt different, not smaller, not larger, just open, and somewhere behind the glass doors ahead, a room full of people who had ignored her minutes ago were now waiting for her to speak. The boardroom door opened again, slower this time, and the shift in the room was immediate. Conversations cut mid-breath, eyes lifted without instruction, and Daniel Mercer did not turn right away, but his posture changed, straighter, tighter, as if he already knew who had stepped back inside. Ava Brooks walked in without rushing, her steps quiet against the glass-lined floor, the same uniform, the same presence. But the air around her felt different now, not invisible, not dismissed, something else, something the room could not quite name. She stopped near the edge of the table, not taking a seat, not asking permission, just standing where she could see the screen clearly, the numbers still glowing, still wrong. Daniel finally looked at her, and for a brief moment, the confidence in his gaze faltered, just enough to be noticed if someone was looking closely. You said there was an error, he said, his voice controlled, but no longer dismissive. Ava met his eyes, calm, steady. Yes, she replied. Simple, direct, no hesitation. A faint tension moved through the executives, some leaning forward slightly, others avoiding eye contact. Altogether, unsure where they now stood in a room that had quietly changed its center. Daniel gestured once toward the screen. Show me, he said, the words measured, deliberate. Ava stepped closer, not hurried, her hand lifting toward the laptop, but stopping just short of touching it. May I? She asked, not out of uncertainty, but clarity. Daniel nodded once, and she turned the screen slightly, adjusting the angle so the reflection of the ceiling lights no longer obscured the data. Her fingers moved across the trackpad with familiarity that did not belong to someone who only cleaned rooms, scrolling, expanding, isolating a section buried beneath layers of projections. Here, she said softly, her voice steady as she highlighted a line. This growth assumption is inflated by 3.8%. A few executives exchanged glances, subtle but sharp. One of them leaned in closer, squinting. That margin was adjusted last week, he said defensively. Ava did not look at him. Her focus remained on the screen. Yes, she said, but the liability adjustment was not updated to match it. She clicked again, revealing another column. So your projected stability is based on numbers that no longer exist. Silence followed, heavier now, undeniable. Daniel stepped closer, his reflection merging with the data on the glass surface, his eyes scanning quickly, then slowing, then stopping. The realization settling in piece by piece, not dramatic, not loud, just precise, like a lock clicking open. If this holds, he said quietly, almost to himself, the entire deal collapses within 6 months. No one argued. No one interrupted, because they could all see it now. The flaw that had been hiding in plain sight. Ava leaned back slightly, giving the space back to the room, her hands lowering to her sides, her role complete in that moment. But Daniel was not looking at the screen anymore. He was looking at her, not as a distraction, not as an interruption, but as something he had failed to recognize. "How did you see this?" he asked, the question simple, but carrying more than curiosity. Ava paused for a second, her gaze steady. "Because I have seen it before," she answered. Nothing more, nothing less. The room held that answer, turning it over silently, trying to place it, to understand it. But before anyone could speak, Daniel straightened, his voice returning, not louder, but clearer. "Everyone else, step out for 5 minutes." The command landed without resistance. Chairs shifted, papers gathered, people moved quickly, quietly, leaving behind a room that no longer felt the same. And as the door closed again, sealing them inside, the distance between them was no longer defined by position, but by something else entirely, something that had just begun to change. The room felt larger once the others left, but not quieter, not in the way silence usually settled. This silence had weight. It pressed against the glass walls, against the polished table, against the space between Daniel Mercer and Ava Brooks, who now stood across from each other without the buffer of titles or witnesses. Daniel moved first, not back to his chair, but closer to the table, his fingers resting lightly against the edge as if grounding himself, his eyes still on the screen, then shifting to her, measuring, recalculating in a way he was not used to doing with people. "You said you have seen this before," he repeated, slower this time, as if the words carried more meaning than he had allowed earlier. Ava did not answer immediately, her gaze drifting for a second to the reflection in the glass, the faint outline of herself standing in a room she had not been invited into. Then back to him, steady again. "Patterns like this do not change," she said quietly. "Only the numbers do." Daniel studied her, not interrupting, not dismissing, something in his expression tightening as pieces began to connect, not fully, not yet, but enough to shift the ground beneath his assumptions. "You are not just a facilities worker," he said, not accusing, not questioning, simply stating what was becoming impossible to ignore. Ava's lips pressed together briefly, not defensive, not ashamed, just careful. "That is the job I have right now," she replied, and the distinction hung in the air, subtle but undeniable. Daniel exhaled. Slowly, his gaze dropping for a moment to the model again. The flaw now obvious, almost glaring, and yet it had taken her one glance, one sentence, to bring it into focus. "If we move forward with this deal," he said, more to himself than to her, "we expose ourselves to losses we cannot absorb." Ava nodded once, small, confirming. "Not immediately," she added. "That is why it was missed. It looks stable in the short term, but the risk compounds quietly." She stepped closer again, pointing to another section. "This variable here, it is tied to external market assumptions that were overly optimistic. If those shift even slightly, everything downstream breaks." Daniel followed her hand, his mind moving quickly, recalculating timelines, scenarios, consequences, his control returning, but not in the same way, not through certainty, through understanding, and for the first time since she had spoken, he did not feel ahead of the problem, he felt behind it. "Why did you speak up?" he asked. Suddenly, the question cutting through the analysis. Ava looked at him, her expression unchanged, but something softer flickered beneath it, something older. "Because someone needed to," she said, simple, without weight, without expectation. Daniel held her gaze for a second longer than necessary, then nodded once, slow, deliberate, as if acknowledging something he had overlooked, not just in the model, but in the room itself. "And if I had not called you back," he said, testing the thought out loud. Ava's eyes shifted briefly toward the door, then back. "You would have signed it," she answered, calm, factual. "And by the time you realized, it would have been too late." The words did not accuse, they did not judge, they simply existed, and that made them heavier. Daniel straightened, his posture changing again, not defensive, not authoritative, something closer to focused, precise. "Stay," he said, not as a command this time, but as a decision. "Walk me through all of it." Ava did not. Respond immediately, not out of hesitation, but consideration, her eyes scanning the room once more, the table, the screen, the space that had shifted around her. Then she nodded, once, quiet, and stepped forward, closer to the center of the table, where decisions were made. And for the first time since she had entered that floor, she did not feel like she was standing at the edge of something. She felt like she was standing inside it, where every word mattered, and every number told the truth whether people wanted to see it or not. Daniel did not sit down. He remained standing beside the table, one hand resting lightly against the glass as Ava moved through the model step by step, her voice calm, even, not rushed, not uncertain, each word placed with the precision of someone who had done this before, many times, in rooms where people listened the first time she spoke. This section here, she said, scrolling slowly, is where the assumption begins to drift. She paused just long enough for him to follow, then continued. The revenue projection is built on a growth rate that was adjusted last week, but the corresponding risk model was never updated to reflect that change. Daniel leaned in slightly, his eyes tracking the numbers, his breathing steady but deeper now, absorbing, recalculating. So the model shows stability, he said, finishing the thought. Ava nodded once. But it is artificial stability, she replied. It only holds if the original assumptions remain true, and they do not. She clicked again, opening another layer, revealing a set of variables tied to external market data. These inputs are based on optimistic forecasts from last quarter, but the market has already shifted. Daniel's jaw tightened slightly. By how much? He asked, his voice lower now, more focused. Ava did not hesitate. Between 2 and 3% in key sectors, she said. That is enough to break the balance entirely. The room seemed to shrink around that number, not because it was large, but because of what it implied. Daniel straightened slightly, his mind moving through scenarios, timelines, consequences. If we adjust for that, he said, half to himself, the projected return drops below our threshold. Ava glanced at him briefly, then back to the screen. And the downside risk increases beyond what your current reserves can absorb, she added. Not harsh, not dramatic, just clear. Daniel exhaled slowly, his fingers tapping once against the glass, a habit he did not seem aware of. So we either walk away, he said, or we restructure the deal entirely. Ava did not answer right away, her eyes scanning the model one more time, searching for something deeper, something not immediately visible. Then she spoke, quieter now. There is a third option. Daniel looked at her, sharp again. Alert, show me, he said. Ava adjusted the screen again, isolating a smaller segment, one that had been overlooked because it seemed insignificant compared to the larger projections. This asset group, she said, pointing. It has been undervalued in the current model. Daniel frowned slightly, leaning closer. Why? He asked. Ava's finger moved across the screen, tracing the connection. Because its performance is tied to a different market cycle, she explained, one that is less affected by the variables causing instability here. She tapped lightly. If you rebalance the structure to lean more heavily on this segment, you reduce your exposure while maintaining a viable return. Daniel studied the data in silence, his eyes narrowing slightly, not in doubt, but in concentration, the kind that came when something unexpected made sense. You are suggesting we shift the foundation of the deal, he said slowly. Ava nodded. Not the entire foundation, she replied. Just enough to stabilize it. Daniel remained still for a moment, the weight of the decision settling in, not just financial, but strategic, reputational, personal. Then he looked at her again, really looked, as if trying to reconcile the person standing in front of him with the role she occupied in his building. You do not belong in facilities, he said quietly, not as a compliment, not as a judgment, just as a realization. Ava's expression did not change, but something in her eyes softened for a fraction of a second. Sometimes where you are is not where you belong, she said, just as quietly, and the truth in that statement lingered longer than anything else she had said. Daniel nodded once, slow, deliberate, then reached for his phone, his voice returning, sharper now, decisive. Get the team back in here, he said, already shifting into action. We are not signing this as is. He ended the call and placed the phone down, his gaze returning to the screen, then to Ava. Stay, he said again. But this time there was no hesitation, no uncertainty, only recognition. And as the door began to open and the team filtered back in, the room did not reset to what it had been before. It adjusted around a new center, one that had been there all along, waiting to be seen. The door opened and the executives filed back in, slower this time, more cautious, their earlier confidence replaced by something quieter, something observant. And as they took their seats, their eyes did not go straight to Daniel Mercer. They went to the screen, then to Ava Brooks, who now stood near the center of the table, no longer at the edge, no longer easy to ignore. Daniel did not sit. He remained standing, one hand resting on the back of his chair, his posture firm but different, less about control, more about direction. "We are revising the structure," he said without preamble, his voice steady, leaving no room for debate. A few heads turned quickly, surprise flickering across faces that had expected confirmation, not change. "There is an inconsistency in the model," he continued, gesturing briefly toward the screen, "and we are correcting it before we move forward." The lead analyst shifted in his seat, his fingers tightening slightly around his tablet. "We already validated the projections," he said carefully, his tone measured but defensive. Daniel did not look at him immediately. His gaze moved. Instead to Ava, just for a second, then back to the table. "You validated a version that no longer reflects current conditions," he replied, calm, precise, the words landing heavier than any raised voice. The room fell quiet again, not frozen, but attentive, listening in a way it had not before. Ava remained still, her hands relaxed at her sides, her presence steady, not pushing forward, not stepping back, simply there. Daniel nodded once toward the screen. "Walk them through it," he said. And this time it was not a request, not a command, but a recognition. Ava stepped forward without hesitation, her fingers moving across the trackpad again, bringing up the same section she had shown him. But now the room was watching, really watching. "The issue begins here," she said, her voice even, carrying clearly across the glass table, no longer small, no longer uncertain. The executives leaned in, some closer than they had before, others slower, more reluctant, but all of them looking. The growth rate was adjusted. She continued, highlighting the line. But the risk model was not updated to match it. The analyst who had spoken earlier frowned, leaning closer. "That adjustment was approved," he said, quieter now, less certain. Ava nodded slightly, acknowledging without conceding. "Yes," she said. But the approval did not account for the downstream impact. She scrolled again, exposing the imbalance more clearly. The room shifted. As the realization spread, not all at once, but in pieces, like a pattern coming into focus. One executive sat back slowly, exhaling under his breath. Another tapped his pen against the table, a soft, uneven rhythm. Daniel watched them, not interrupting, not guiding, letting the understanding settle on its own. Then Ava moved to the next section. "There is an alternative," she said, her tone unchanged, but the weight of her words different now. The room stilled again, waiting. "If we rebalance the structure to increase exposure to this asset group," she indicated the segment she had shown Daniel earlier. "We reduce the risk created by the current assumptions." The associate who had first noticed the issue nodded slowly, her eyes moving between the columns. "It stabilizes the model," she said, almost to herself. Ava met her gaze briefly, then looked back to the screen. "It does," she confirmed. Daniel stepped forward then, his voice returning, firm, decisive. "That is the direction we are taking," he said, and this time no one argued. No one pushed back, because the numbers spoke louder than hierarchy, louder than titles, and the truth had already been laid out in front of them. Undeniable. The meeting shifted from defense to adjustment, from assumption to correction, and through it all, Ava remained at the center of it, not elevated, not spotlighted, just present where it mattered most. And as the discussion moved forward, Daniel glanced at her once more, not as an interruption, not as an afterthought, but as someone he now understood he should have been listening to from the very beginning. The discussion moved faster now, voices overlapping in controlled urgency, screens lighting up as assistants pulled updated data. But beneath the motion there was a different rhythm, one that had not been there before, something steadier, more grounded. and at the center of it, Ava Brooks stood quietly, her hands resting lightly at the edge of the table, watching as the room adjusted around the truth she had uncovered. Daniel Mercer paced once along the length of the glass wall, his reflection following him in sharp lines, his mind clearly working through layers of consequence. "We need revised projections within the hour," he said, his voice cutting cleanly through the noise, "and I want every assumption revalidated against current market data." The team responded immediately, nodding, typing, recalculating, but there was a shift in how they moved now, less automatic, more deliberate, as if they understood that what had been missed once could not be missed again. Ava's gaze drifted briefly to the skyline beyond the glass, the city stretching endlessly in the distance, then back to the screen where numbers continued to shift and settle, the model rebuilding itself in real time. Daniel stopped pacing and turned back toward the table, his eyes scanning the updated figures, then pausing, something catching his attention again. "This adjustment," he said, pointing to a newly modified section. "It stabilizes the short term. But what happens if volatility increases beyond expected thresholds?" The question hung in the air, directed to the room. But it was Ava who answered, her voice calm, measured. "Then the model begins to fracture again," she said, stepping slightly closer, not intruding, just present where the question existed. Daniel looked at her, a brief nod acknowledging the response. "So we are not just fixing the model," he said slowly. "We are reinforcing it." Ava nodded once. "Yes," she replied. "You are building resilience, not just balance." The word seemed to settle differently. Resilience, not something easily captured in a spreadsheet, but something that determined whether systems held or collapsed under pressure. One of the senior executives leaned back, exhaling quietly. "We should have seen this," he muttered, not to anyone in particular. Ava did not respond, her focus remaining on the data, because what mattered now was not what had been missed, but what was being corrected. Daniel's phone buzzed softly against the table, a message flashing briefly on the screen. He glanced at it, then set it face down without reading it fully, his attention returning to the room, to the numbers, to her. "How long would it take to fully restructure this?" he asked, not looking away from the model. Ava considered for a moment, her eyes tracing the layers of data, the connections, the dependencies. "If the team aligns quickly," she said, "a few hours for a stable revision, a few days for something that holds under stress." Daniel nodded slowly, absorbing the timeline, the weight of it. Then he looked around the table, meeting the eyes of each person there, one by one, something firm settling into his expression. "Then we do it right," he said, not louder, not harsher, but with a clarity that left no room for shortcuts, no room for assumptions. The team responded with quiet agreement, a collective shift toward precision, toward accountability. And through it all, Ava remained exactly where she was, not elevated above the process, not removed from it, simply integrated into it in a way that felt inevitable now, as if the room had always needed her perspective and had only just realized it. Daniel's gaze returned to her once more, lingering just a second longer this time, not questioning, not evaluating, but recognizing. And in that moment, something subtle but permanent settled into place, not just in the model on the screen, but in the way he saw the person standing across from him, someone who had walked into the room unnoticed and was now quietly reshaping everything inside it. The room had settled into a focused rhythm, the kind that only came when uncertainty was replaced by direction. But beneath that surface, something else lingered, something quieter, something unresolved. Daniel Mercer stood at the head of the table now, not speaking, just watching as the updated model continued to take shape, numbers adjusting, columns realigning, risk factors recalibrating. And yet his attention was not fully on the screen. It moved, again and again, back to Ava Brooks, who stood a few feet away, her posture relaxed but attentive, her eyes following the flow of data with a familiarity that did not fade. One of the analysts cleared his throat softly, breaking the silence that had settled between bursts of activity. "The revised structure holds under current conditions," he said, glancing at his tablet. "But we are still exposed if external volatility spikes beyond projected ranges." Daniel nodded slightly, his gaze shifting to Ava without hesitation this time. Not because he lacked answers, but because he recognized where clarity had come from before. "What do we miss this time?" he asked, his tone steady, direct. The room followed the question, eyes moving to her, waiting. Ava did not rush to answer. Her gaze returned to the screen, scanning, not for what was obvious, but for what was hidden, for what had not yet been questioned. Seconds passed, longer than before, and in those seconds, no one spoke, no one interrupted, because something had changed. They trusted the silence now. Ava stepped closer, her hand hovering briefly above the trackpad before making a small adjustment, pulling up a deeper layer of the model, one that had not been part of the main discussion. "You are still assuming control over variables you do not actually control," she said quietly, the words landing with a different kind of weight, not sharp, not urgent, but undeniable. Daniel frowned slightly, leaning in. "Explain," he said, not challenging, just asking. Ava pointed to a cluster of inputs tied to third-party dependencies. "These projections rely on external partners maintaining consistent performance," she said. "But their stability is based on the same market assumptions that already shifted." One of the executives shifted in his chair, his expression tightening as he followed the connection. "So even if we fix our side," he said slowly, "we are still exposed through them." Ava nodded once. "Yes," she replied. "You reduced internal risk, but external risk remains unaccounted for." The room went quiet again. But this time it was different. Not uncertainty, not confusion, something closer to realization. Daniel straightened, his hand moving from the table to rest briefly against his chin, a habit of thought rather than control. "What is the adjustment?" he asked, his voice lower now, more deliberate. Ava's eyes remained on the screen, but her voice did not waver. "You build in a buffer," she said. "You assume variability instead of consistency, and you structure the deal so it can absorb that shift without breaking." Daniel considered that, his gaze moving across the data, imagining the structure, the implications, the cost, then back to her. "That reduces profit margins," he said, not as an objection, but as a fact. Ava met his eyes, steady. "It preserves survival," she answered, simple, direct. The words hung in the air, heavier than any number on the screen, and for a moment, no one spoke, because the choice was no longer abstract. It was clear: profit or stability, assumption or resilience. Daniel exhaled slowly, the tension in his posture easing just slightly, not because the problem was solved, but because it was understood. "Then we adjust," he said finally, his voice firm again, but grounded in something different now, something earned. The team moved quickly, implementing the changes, recalculating once more, but the room felt different again, not just because the model was improving, but because the way they approached it had changed. And as the numbers shifted into alignment, more stable, more realistic, Daniel looked at Ava. Once more, not out of habit, not out of necessity, but out of recognition, the kind that does not come from titles or roles, but from something deeper, something proven in moments when everything else begins to fail. The updated model settled into place slowly, like a structure finally finding its balance. Numbers no longer fighting each other, projections aligning with reality instead of resisting it. And for the first time since the meeting had begun, the room exhaled, not in relief, but in recognition of how close they had come to missing it entirely. Daniel Mercer stood still at the head of the table, his gaze fixed on the final output, not scanning for errors anymore, but absorbing what it meant. The deal in front of him was no longer the same one he had walked into the room ready to sign. It was smaller in profit, tighter in structure, but stronger, grounded in something that would hold. And yet the weight of that realization did not sit lightly. It pressed against something deeper, something harder to ignore. He reached out and closed the laptop halfway, not shutting it completely, just enough to pause the flood of data. "We move forward with this version," he said, his voice steady, leaving no room for uncertainty. The team nodded, some quickly, others more slowly, each understanding the shift that had taken place, not just in the numbers, but in the way decisions had been made. One of the senior executives spoke up carefully. "It reduces our projected return by nearly 8%, he said, not challenging, but stating the cost. Daniel did not look at him right away. His eyes remained on the reflection in the glass, then lifted, calm, certain. "It prevents a loss that would have cost us everything," he replied, The room went quiet again. But this time it was not tension. It was acceptance, the kind that comes when the truth is clear enough to outweigh hesitation. Daniel straightened slightly, his posture shifting back into leadership, but not the same kind as before. This one carried awareness. Finalize the revisions, he said, and prepare the updated terms for review. Chairs moved. Screens dimmed. The team began to gather their things, the energy in the room transitioning from urgency to execution. But as people stood and stepped away from the table, their eyes lingered, not on Daniel, but on Ava Brooks, who remained where she was, her hands resting lightly at her sides, her expression unchanged, as if none of this had altered her position in the world beyond this room. One by one, they exited, quieter than they had entered, the door opening and closing in soft intervals until only two figures remained, Daniel and Ava. The silence between them now different again, not heavy, not uncertain, something closer to stillness. Daniel walked around the table slowly, stopping a few feet from her, not too close, not distant, just enough to speak without raising his voice. For a moment he did not say anything, his gaze steady, searching for the right words in a space he was not used to navigating. Then he spoke. "You saw what all of us missed," he said, not as praise, not as surprise, but as fact. Ava met his eyes calmly, offering no reaction, no expectation, just acknowledgement. Daniel nodded slightly, as if confirming something to himself. "You could have walked away," he continued. "You were already told to leave." Ava's gaze shifted briefly, almost imperceptibly, then returned. "I almost did," she said quietly, the honesty in her voice simple, unguarded. Daniel exhaled softly, the faintest trace of something human crossing his expression, something that had not been there when the meeting began. "Why did you not?" he asked, the question softer now. Ava paused for a moment, her eyes lowering just slightly, then lifting again, steady as before. "Because it would not have been right," she answered, nothing more, nothing less. The words settled between them, not dramatic, not heavy, just clear, and in that clarity, Daniel understood something that had nothing to do with financial models or risk analysis, something quieter, something he had not accounted for. He looked at her for a moment longer, then nodded once, deliberate, as if accepting not just her answer, but what it revealed. And for the first time that day, he did not have a response, not a command, not a decision, just silence. And in that silence, something shifted again, not in the room, not in the deal, but in him. The room did not move after her answer. It simply held it, quiet and steady, as if the words had settled into the walls themselves. Daniel Mercer remained where he was, his posture no longer rigid, no longer guarded, his gaze drifting briefly toward the window where the city stretched out in sharp lines of steel and glass. Everything still moving out there, deals being made, decisions being rushed, assumptions being trusted, and for the first time in a long time, he felt the weight of how easily something small, something overlooked, could unravel everything built on top of it. He turned back to Ava Brooks, studying her again, not searching for credentials, not trying to place her into a category that made sense to him, but simply seeing her as she stood, calm, grounded, unchanged by everything that had just shifted around her. "You said you have seen this before," he said, his voice quieter now, not demanding, just asking. Ava held his gaze for a moment, then looked slightly past him, not avoiding, just choosing her words carefully. "I used to build models like this," she said, her tone even, not proud, not distant, just factual. Daniel did not react immediately, but something in his expression sharpened, a piece of the puzzle finally locking into place. "Where?" he asked, the question simple, but carrying more weight than it sounded. Ava exhaled softly, a breath that seemed to carry years behind it. "Downtown," she said. "Risk Analysis Division, international firm." Daniel nodded slowly, recognizing the level without needing a name, his eyes narrowing slightly as he recalculated everything he thought he knew about her. "Then why are you here?" he asked, not as judgment, not as disbelief, but as a genuine question that no longer fit into the world he understood. Ava's eyes lowered for just a second, then lifted again, steady as before. "Life changes things," she said. "My mother got sick. I left to take care of her." She paused briefly, not for effect, just because the memory existed. After she passed, I tried to go back, but the gap, the time away, it changed how people saw me. Daniel listened without interrupting, without filling the silence, something in his expression softening in a way that had nothing to do with sympathy and everything to do with understanding. "So you took this job," he said, not as a conclusion, but as a continuation. Ava nodded once. "It was what I could get," she replied. Simple, direct. Daniel looked down at the table, at the closed laptop, at the reflection of both of them standing there, and for a moment, the titles that had defined the room earlier felt smaller, less certain. "You were willing to walk away from this," he said, referring not to the job, but to the moment, to the chance to step back into something she clearly understood. Ava's expression remained calm, but her answer came without hesitation. "I was willing to do what was right," she said. The same quiet clarity as before. Daniel nodded slowly, absorbing that, not just as a statement, but as a standard, something that did not shift depending on position or recognition. He stepped back slightly, giving the space between them a different shape, not distance, but room for something to exist that had not been there before. "Most people in that room would have stayed silent," he said, not accusing anyone, just stating what he knew to be true. Ava did not disagree. She simply looked at him, waiting. Daniel exhaled once more, then straightened, his voice returning, not louder, but more certain. "You did not," he said, and in those 3 words there was acknowledgement, respect, and something else, something he was not used to offering without hesitation. He reached for the chair at the head of the table, then paused, his hand resting lightly against it, as if reconsidering something as simple as where he stood. Then he let it go, stepping away from it instead, turning back to her. "You should not be invisible in a place like this," he said, not as a compliment, not as a promise, but as a truth he could no longer ignore. And for a moment, the room was still again. But this time it did not feel like silence. It felt like something opening, something that had been closed for a long time, finally shifting, even if just a little. Daniel did not move immediately after his own words, as if even he needed a moment to understand what he had just acknowledged. The room holding that quiet shift between them. Ava Brooks standing steady, not stepping forward into it, not stepping away, just present in the space where something real had finally been spoken. The city beyond the glass windows glowed brighter now, sunlight reflecting off distant towers. But inside the room the light felt softer, less sharp, less cold. Daniel glanced once toward the door, then back to her, his expression no longer guarded, but measured in a different way, as if he was choosing each step more carefully now. "There is an opening," he said, his voice calm, deliberate, not rushed. "Risk analysis, internal strategy." He paused briefly, not to create tension, but because the words mattered, a position that should have been filled months ago. Ava listened without reacting, her posture unchanged, her hands resting lightly at her sides. Daniel continued. "You are qualified for it," he said, not as speculation, not as encouragement, but as fact. The room seemed to hold that statement, even though they were the only 2 in it. Ava's gaze shifted slightly, not avoiding him, just considering, her eyes moving briefly to the table, to the closed laptop, to the reflection of everything that had just unfolded, then back to him. "That is not my job," she said quietly, not dismissing, not refusing, just stating the reality she had been living in. Daniel nodded once, understanding the difference she was drawing. "It is not the job you were given," he replied, "but it is the one you have already done." The words settled differently, not pushing, not insisting, just placing the truth where it could not be ignored. Ava exhaled softly, her shoulders lowering just slightly, not from pressure, but from something internal, something shifting. "People do not usually get asked twice," she said, her tone calm, but carrying something deeper, something learned. Daniel met her gaze without hesitation. "I am not asking twice," he said, not sharp, not forceful, just certain. "I am asking once, correctly." The distinction lingered between them, subtle but powerful. Ava looked at him for a moment longer, as if measuring not the offer, but the intention behind it, the difference between opportunity and convenience, between being used and being recognized. The silence stretched, not uncomfortable, just full. Then she spoke. slower this time. If I take that position, she said, it is not because I was in the right place at the right time. Daniel did not interrupt, did not redirect. He simply listened. Ava continued, her voice steady. It is because I earned it. Daniel nodded immediately. No hesitation, no adjustment. You did, he said, the certainty in his voice leaving no space for doubt. Ava held his gaze for another second, then gave a small nod, not dramatic, not emotional. Just a quiet acceptance of something that had already been true before this moment. Daniel reached for the chair at the head of the table again, then stopped, his hand resting on the back of it. He looked at her, then slowly pulled the chair back, not sitting, just creating space. An unspoken gesture, simple, but deliberate. Ava glanced at it, then at him, understanding without needing explanation. The room did not shift loudly. Nothing dramatic changed in that instant. But something fundamental had moved, something that would not return to what it had been. And as the light from the windows stretched further across the glass table, catching the edge of the chair now slightly angled away from its usual place, the silence that followed did not feel empty. It felt complete, like a decision that had already been made long before either of them had the words to say it. The chair remained slightly pulled back, untouched, its position small but undeniable. And for a moment neither of them moved toward it, as if the meaning behind that gesture mattered more than the act itself. Daniel Mercer stood a few feet away, his posture no longer defined by authority alone, but by something quieter, something that had been reshaped over the course of a single morning. Ava Brooks looked at the chair, then at the table, then at the window where the city continued its relentless motion, unchanged by what had just shifted inside this room. She stepped forward slowly, not toward the head of the table, not immediately, but toward the space beside it, her hand brushing lightly against the glass surface, feeling its cool stillness beneath her fingertips, grounding, real. Daniel watched her, not directing, not correcting, simply allowing the moment to unfold in its own way, because for the first time, he understood that control was not always about leading first. Sometimes it was about making space for what should have been there all along. Ava stopped beside the chair, her gaze steady, thoughtful, as if measuring not the seat, but everything it represented, the years she had spent being overlooked, the decisions made without her voice, the moments where silence had been expected instead of truth. She exhaled softly, then placed her hand on the back of the chair, not gripping, just resting. A quiet acknowledgement. Daniel shifted slightly, the faintest movement, as if he was about to speak, then chose not to. The silence holding, full but not heavy. Ava turned the chair just enough to face the table properly. Not dramatic, not symbolic, just precise. And then she sat, not hesitantly, not cautiously, but naturally, as if it had always been her place to do so. The room did not react. There was no audience, no applause, just the soft sound of the chair settling into position. Daniel let out a slow breath he had not realized he was holding, something in his expression easing, not because the moment was over, but because it had landed exactly where it needed to. He moved to the side of the table, no longer at the head, his position shifting without announcement, without explanation, simply aligning with the change that had already taken place. Ava looked at the closed laptop in front of her, then opened it again, the screen lighting up with the final model, stable, balanced, real. Her fingers rested lightly on the keyboard, not typing yet, just present. Daniel's voice came after a moment, quieter than before, but clear. We move forward from here, he said, not as a command, but as a shared understanding. Ava nodded once, her eyes still on the screen, the reflection of both of them faintly visible in the glass beneath. Two figures no longer separated by assumption, by title, by who was meant to speak and who was meant to stay silent. Outside, the light shifted slightly as clouds passed over the skyline, softening the edges of the city, and inside, the room held a different kind of clarity, one that did not come from numbers alone, but from something less visible, something that could not be modeled or projected. Ava began to type, small, precise movements, refining, reinforcing, building something that would hold beyond this moment. And Daniel stood beside the table, not above it, not ahead of it, simply part of it, watching not as someone who had all the answers, but as someone who had finally learned where to look for them. And in the quiet rhythm of keys against glass, and the steady hum of the city beyond. The shift completed itself, not loudly, not dramatically, but fully, like something that had always been waiting to be seen, finally brought into the light.